Welcome to the, we're all ready? Ready to go? Great, excellent, thank you. This, we're picking up where we left off last time. This name of the series is, I forget the title, but the Orthodox Jews in Galicia in the modern era, which is identical with 1772 to 1942. Tonight is lecture 4 out of 6. Title of tonight's lecture is Imperial Protection. Orthodox Jews and the Germans, the Poles and the Ukrainians. As you can see, this is being sponsored by Anonymous, right. And he wants to stay that way. And that's fine. And without any further ado, we'll get down to work. As always, I want to thank all the people, the tech team that put everything together. Tonight, we're going to turn to politics in Galicia. I'm talking about real politics, not intra-Jewish politics. We have to look, therefore, at the non-Jews in Galicia, the Goyim, who, of course, outnumbered the Jews. So there are three basic groups of people who are not Jewish in Galicia in the period we're talking about. You got your Poles, you got your Ruthenians, and you got your Austrians. The term Ukrainians was a term they invented in the 19th century. Many people don't know that. They didn't even have that kind of distinct national identity. A lot of these Eastern European groups, they didn't actually create their language until the 19th century. I know it's hard for Westerners to understand that, but when you deal with peasant societies, things like it's a lot more complicated, do you imagine? And so if the Ukrainians, I'm talking in the cultural sense, it's a little bit like the English at the time of Beowulf. You know, they're just beginning to put the language together, you see? And they weren't exactly clear of their own identity. And again, that's something you take for granted. If you're Jewish, you're like stamped with a big identity on your head when you're born. It goes back a couple thousand years, right? Everybody knows 1,000 years. If you're from, it's like 3,000 years. If you're not from 2,000, but it's 1,000 years. But if you're in Eastern Europe and all the rest, you're a peasant that's, never been away from a mile from your house, right? I mean, you're talking about these kind of lives, or 10 miles, ever. And, you don't know what's going on in the world out there. It's hard for people here to imagine what I'm talking about. I'm well aware of that, but that's how it was once upon a time, okay, for of mankind. And consequently, in the 19th century, when nationalism started among certain groups, which had long-standing identities, I'll give you an example, the Germans, the French, they've been around for a long time. So it's like catching a cold. These other peasant ethnicities caught that cold, and they started working on whether or not, are we a separate people? Heck, yes, we are. Took a couple generations for that to gel, and this is what you call today Ukraine. So that's why Putin is not totally crazy. He's only partially crazy when he says, the Ukrainians, that's a new thing. You understand? Now, it doesn't matter. They consider it that way, and they sure as heck don't consider them part of the Russians. And we're going to see when we get, hopefully on Wednesday night, they sure as heck didn't consider them part of the Poles. But some of them did, so it's very complicated. I realize I'm only scratching the surface. It's hard to get these very complex ideas across in a minute or two, but I just tried. Now, consequently, you had the Poles, you had the Ruthenians, who later on became called the Ukrainians. And you had the Austrians, who were the rulers, who are not really living, they're the ruling class, a very small number of bureaucrats, things like that. Then you got the Jews. Now, the most important group of this in the period we're talking about, the 1800s, were the Poles, who basically, you have to understand where they're coming from. Ech nafla Poland. How could the great Polish Empire, no, what happened to us? What the heck happened? We used to be this, right? We were the biggest country in Europe. I'll say it again, they were the biggest country in Europe, and then they disappeared. So in other words, you're living in Poland in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. What the heck happened? My grandfather's time, we were like mighty. How did this happen? You see? And they never got over it, and I don't blame them. And basically, what you and I know, let's go to the next one, is that there were various surgeries. And by the time it's over, all this was Poland, but it was taken up by Russia, by Prussia, and by Austria, by the Habsburgs. And if you go to, the third partition of Poland, Austria, for a short time, had double the Galicia. They had this, the Galicia part, and then in the third partition of Poland, they even got a bigger chelik, although they're going to lose that for pretty shortly. So had things turned out differently, the Austrians, Franz Joseph, they would even rule Lublin and close to Warsaw and places like that. So this is how the great powers played around with the territory. Russia, in the time of Catherine the Great, very cleverly just annexed the non-Polish parts. You see? They took over the Belarus and the Ukraine, which is gigantic. And they said, let the stupid Prussians and Austrians deal with the Poles. That's like a hornet's nest. Because the Poles are going to say, how did you take our land away? Right? But the Ukrainians, they consider dumb. And the Belarusians, they consider dumb, because most of them were just peasants. You understand? And it's easier to handle them. You take over Warsaw in these places, there's a whole national tradition you're going to have to fight against. And indeed, in the Napoleonic era, and I'm not going to give you too many details, the Austrians frequently battled the Poles. Here's a piece from a very famous Polish movie, not that you are familiar with Polish movies, which is They're Gone with the Wind. It's called Ashes. It's a very famous Polish novel. And here's a Polish patriot being hanged by Austria. I'm just saying it like this. And you say, what the heck does Austria have to do with Poland? You know, they had that extra piece, and during the Napoleonic era, several times the Poles rose in rebellion, and the Austrians crushed them. And you see the guys saying, in the name of the emperor, we're going to hang you, and so on and so forth. This is a very well-known, I don't know how to, over-exaggerate it. Ashes is like, going with the wind, and so forth. And you see he doesn't even want to do it, and he is a strong, long live the emperor. That's what he's screaming, because he was loyal to Napoleon, because they thought Napoleon would free Poland. You understand? And these other Polish noblemen are compelled to watch, as you see. And this movie was made like in the 60s, I think, under the communists. You understand? But it's such a classic piece of Polish literature and history that was made then. And you'll see in 1 second, he took off the guy's decoration. Here's the Polish army. The Poles made an army. They tried to fight the Austrians, and they got beaten time after time. Here are the Polish troops, on the one hand doing a bridge, and the guys in the white are the Austrians coming on. You see? And as I said before, this is what to you and I is called the Civil War and the war between the states, and we know that. So, that's what these guys know of their history, and the Austrians always beat them and crushed them. Okay? As a matter of fact, the Polish national anthem is all about this. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła, Poland is not yet crushed. And March, Poniatowski and so forth. So this is just part of who they were. Now, by the time you get to, again, the Poles always lost. So by the time the Napoleonic era is over, after 1815, when the countries of Europe got together to settle their map for 100 years, so the Poles just were left with frustration because the map stayed as it was in the east, Prussia, Russia, Austria. There's no Poland, you see? And if Prussia and Russia and Austria would have been smart enough, as they were for 100 years, not to fight each other, it'd be like three crooks saying like this, I got my territory, and a few blocks away is your territory. If you your territory, I'm making money, you're making money. So as long as we don't what? Fight, we're all safe. You see? We're all safe. So that's what happened for 100 years. And then, in 1914, they made a mistake. Otherwise, it'd still be like that today. So this is the background for the Jews who are living in the Galicia. By this final settlement in 1815, the Russians actually took over the Hornet's Nest. They took over the main part of Poland. So again, Galicia went back to being this little part over here, relatively, and the Russians took this whole business, what they call Congress Poland, and added to the Russian Empire with special circumstances, and they were the ones who had to deal with the Hornet's Nest. From then on, all the uprisings, revolutions against the Russians. Not against the Austrians, that's an important part of the story. There's one small exception to that, but a small exception. And so basically, remember, going tonight, and this is going to affect the Jews, the general trend between the Austrians and the Poles is to somehow or other bury the hatchet in the 19th century and try to come out with the most pleasant possible modus vivendi, you see? Now, the situation in Galicia is very complicated, and this is something we're going to be dealing with later, because, as I said before, the problems of Galicia is artificial. They match together A plus B. This part is called Western Galicia, and it's Krakow, Auschwitz is there, for example, many other places. Many of you, I have no doubt whatsoever, are descended from parents from towns in Western Galicia, and they're all Polacks, everybody there, the peasants and everyone. On the other hand, if you go in the eastern part to the right, so the majority of the people are Ukrainian. You see? They don't like the Polks either. To be perfectly honest, even the nobles were originally Ukrainian, and they converted to Polishism, they called Polonizing, hundreds of years ago. And that's got a ton, both halves have a ton of Jews, but the eastern half has more Jews, you see? Now, so it's so complicated, and therefore when the Poles, I'm simply bringing the following up. When the Poles say, we want to restore the old kingdom of Poland, if you're living in eastern Galicia, you're not actually Polish, you're a Ruthenian peasant, why do you want to restore the old Poland? What do you give it to him? You get it? Is it just with a country where I was a peasant? I was oppressed. Why should I be a Polish patriot? You see, it didn't do me any good. Now, indeed, as events proved, the class stratification was such. What did Poland even mean to a Polish peasant in Western Galicia? After all, they're all held very low and crushed like slaves by the Polish nobles for hundreds of years. So what do I want to restore? Notice, if I'm a Polish peasant, why exactly do I want to get rid of the Austrians? To bring the nobles back? My conditions actually get worse. You understand? We'll go back to the old days where if the Schlacht, if the Polish landlord rose by and just feel like shooting me, he could do it. Or attacking my wife, and he could do it. At least under the Austrians, it's a little bit of law and order. You see? So that's a very important point to understand over here. Because the Austrians had helped the peasantry to some degree. So the Poles, who were a small, mostly unrepresented class of unrepresentative class of nobles and intellectuals, they had trouble creating a vibrant national movement along the lines of other peoples. Because if you're French, so all there are different classes of Frenchmen, but they all have a lot in common. They're all French, or Italians, or Germans. But to get to Poland, the class system was so pronounced that Poland, for hundreds of years, it only meant the top dogs, the 1,100 families of the nobles. And everybody else was under them as a slave. So why should these people at the bottom have what you call a national feeling? You understand? It doesn't speak to them. Plus, they're illiterate. Now, no, it's true. The main foe of the Poles, therefore, in this new setup was Russia, Tsarist Russia. That was the big problem. And the Poles didn't like it, and they revolted twice, very famously, in 1830 and 1863. In both times, the Russians ruthlessly crushed the Poles. That's your next one. That's why Putin, well, that's Nicholas I and Alexander II, the two czars that did it. But Putin obviously styles himself in that image. You get it? He's going to restore the rebellious provinces, as it were. And by the way, they played hardball, took away the Polish language, exiled and killed a lot of people. You know, Russians really crushed them. Now, after that, after 1863, the Russians sat very heavily on the Poles, and the Poles simply seized in helpless rage. There were 70,000 Russian soldiers occupying Warsaw. What the heck is Warsaw going to do? You make a move, they will crush you. Instead, that's how it is. It's like being under Stalin in some respects. So your rage doesn't do you any good. Now, the story in Galicia, which is the next problem it's over, is still more complex. There was indeed one uprising by the Poles against the Austrians in 1846. But watch this. The Austrians didn't have to do anything. They just said like this: peasants, we give you permission to kill the nobles. And they did. It's called the Galician story. Look at this. They just paint them by the head. They're bringing in the heads. Oh my God. Get it? So in other words, so the Poles felt like stupid beyond belief, because these are all Poles, rise for your freedom. And the peasants, well, freedom? Okay, I'm going to kill the guy. Now I want you to understand, all throughout the countryside in 1846, you had, men, women, and children were killed by the peasant population. They went to the manor house of the lord, the prince, the this and that and the other, and just killed everybody because Hutra or Ritzua. You get it? The government said they're all rebels. There's no punishment if you kill them. Actually, they gave like $10 for every head of a nobleman. For a peasant, they don't see $10 in a long time. So what I'm trying to say like this exposed the Polish nationalist patriotic revolutionary movement as a farce in Galicia. Okay? The mortified Poles afterwards realized several things after this. A, the way Polish society was set up, they could not successfully defeat the Austrians. New societal and cultural arrangements had to be put in place. So you're going to have to create a better social system without all that oppression. You notice you got to offer him something, so that if tomorrow Poland will rise, it won't be like it was before. And number two, they had a Ruthenian problem, or if you want a Ukrainian problem on their hands, because, again, in eastern Galicia, the Poles make a rising, all the Austrians got to do is say, what? I'm going to stick the peasants on you, you know? You got vast majority are Ukrainian peasants. Just tell them, you don't want the Poles, just kill them, you know, no problem. You see? So it's, welcome to Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is wonderfully complicated, and I'm not even doing a good job here. I'm just giving you the when I say I'm scratching the surface, I know you don't know what I'm talking about, but I assure you I'm just scratching the surface on this, because it's a lot more complicated than I'm saying. But for the purposes of Jewish history, it suffices. Now, because all the Austrians had to do was play the Ruthenian card. That's what they did. And even if somehow or other the Galician Poles would defeat the Austrians, the Russians and the Prussians would just move in and crush them. And their situation would be worse, not better. They'd be worse under the Russians. And so, little by little, through hard knocks and experience, they had no choice but to learn a couple lessons, and they came to realize, actually, the best move for the Poles in Galicia would be to gain autonomy within the Austrian Empire. You understand? Actually, the way we have it is the best of the scenarios. It's better than being under Russia. It's better than being under Prussia, because those countries are much more crushing. We want to get an upgrade in how we are within Austria. This is the best we're going to have in our lifetime until the world goes upside down, which it did in World War I, right? But until the world goes upside down and things change. For now, let's be pragmatic, make the best of it. And so, at the end of the day, the Poles wanted their freedom, and they used the language of human rights and national self-determination. But of course, what they meant by the rights of freedom and national self-determination was the right to screw over the Ruthenians. You get it? This is Eastern Europe. Now, welcome, therefore, that's why Woodrow Wilson was a fool. Everybody knows that. Knows he discovered this in Versailles, because he came over after the First World War with all these ringing declarations and the 14 points, and we're going to, every group should govern itself, and there should be national determination, self-determination, and each place in Europe should be self-running. And then they tell them, well, what are we doing in Galicia? You know, where you got the Poles here, and next door is this. It's a little bit like, it's not exactly the same thing, a little bit like the situation you have with Israel and the Palestinians. Everybody's mingled all over the place, and each would like to wipe out the other. You understand? I mean, this is the reality of it. Now, meanwhile, a whole slew of revolutions broke out in 1848. This is very famous. I think we did a series on this a couple years ago. In many places in the Austrian Empire, all over Europe, but in many places in the Austrian Empire, shaking it to its foundations. This is called 1848, the year of revolutions. So, without getting too technical, there was a big revolution in Vienna and one in Prague, and a giant thing in Hungary, which the Austrians themselves couldn't beat until they finally did. And there's almost one over here, that's the point, in Galicia. And it shook the empire to its foundations. At first, the revolutionaries seemed to be winning, so the Habsburgs, the royal family, made all kind of liberal concessions, basically agreeing to a parliamentary system and a sharp reduction in royal power, because they used to be dictators. Now, because of the revolution, they were willing to give in. But in the long run, through eventual military success, playing divide and conquer between, like I say, the Galicians versus the Ruthenians, they did it in Hungary with the Croatians and Romanians, because the Hungarians were screwing the Croatians and Romanians, you see? So I'm telling you, it's just very complicated for an American, getting help from Russia, and finally appointing a brilliant, cynical reactionary as chancellor. The Habsburgs bounced back. They suppressed all the revolutions, and they withdrew all the liberal concessions and restored the absolutist powers. This is the famous guy, Schwarzenberg, who was... The Austrians usually didn't have any brilliant statesmen. It's rare that they did. And he put everything back together. First thing he did when he took over was he fired the emperor. He shook up the rickety government of Ferdinand Metternich. Metternich, he said, you're out. And even the emperor... I told this once before, people won't remember. The emperor, let's look at the guy after him. No, the one after him. Franz Joseph. Wait a second. This guy had been the emperor from 1835 to 1848. When I say feeble-minded, that's a medical description. That's not making fun of him. You understand? He really was mentally defective. So he was therefore a puppet of the ruling class, of Metternich. You get it? He was, that's what it was. He's to a certain degree challenged. That's what he was. And it tells you about the system in Central Europe that you could do a thing like that. But it didn't really work. And so the result was, the guys behind the throne were scheming against each other. But just take my word for it, didn't work. So instead, this guy said, let's fire him and put in a normal guy with energy. Let's go back one. And that's the original Franz Joseph, who was 18 years old. But they said, better get an 18-year-old guy, even though he's not educated and so on and so forth. He's very young, but at least he's normal. He's mentally normal, get it? And he had a little bit of, he'd been in the army. It's going to sound funny. Of all the Habsburg princes, he's the only one who didn't have serious mental problems, get it? So he said, put him on there. So that's how Franz Joseph became the emperor, and that's why he ruled for so long, because he started out very young. You see? Now, there's no comparison with him and the next guy, as I said before, of course. And on the other hand, the new Kaiser was only 18 years old, so how educated are you at the age of 18? And he didn't go to college. I want you to understand, in the old royal system, it's not like today. You had kings with no college education. It's hard for us to fathom that. You get it? Now, if you happen to be very brilliant on your own, like a Frederick the Great or Catherine the Great, you have the equivalent of a college degree. You just read a lot. You understand? And you talked with smart people and things like this. A lot of people didn't do that. A lot of your emperors didn't do that. You see? Often they had a little bit of military training. I mean, an 18, 19-year-old guy, who, even in West Point, he's not really ready to be president of the United States. You understand? Let alone an absolute ruler of Russia, of Austria, of Prussia. That's how the royal system went. I mean, Queen Victoria never went to college. You see what I'm saying? Edward VII never went to college. George III never went to college. It's funny how these systems work. You understand? It doesn't quite fit, the way you think about it. You would actually need a guy who's like 30 years old at least, and had some degree of college education, and hopefully a little bit of experience along the way in government. Oh, now you're ready. That's the Plato system in the Republic. You get these guys and give them an education that prepares them for government, but that's not how the system worked over here. And so as a result, this guy's going to be charged of Galicia to the end of Galicia almost, okay, from 1848 to 1916. And Galicia went in 1918. So for the rest of their lives, they're going to have one king or one emperor at that time, and that's why he's of significant. Now, as I said before, over the course of his reign, he would show himself as someone who had common sense but poor judgment. So in college, we would give him a C+ or a B-. He's certainly not an A, as you can see. See, he was no dummy, but he wasn't smart, and he lacked sound judgment. And it took him down, because he's the one, when he's 84 years old, as we shall see, who said, what the heck, let's just go to war and start World War I. See? And, that took him down, took the whole thing down. Everything collapsed. And he didn't need to do it. It was just a matter of poor judgment. You see? I'm not saying he was a bad person, he was not a bad person. But you can't run a business without judgment. Would you agree with that statement? You can't run a business without sound judgment. And you certainly can't run a government and an empire without sound judgment. So you can be a nice guy, but you need the judgment. Now, that's just interesting. It was the hope of Prince Schwarzenberg that the deficiencies of the young emperor would be made up by himself and by the emperor's mother over a long period of time. Figure, listen, we'll be in charge for the next 10, 20 years. We will educate him. Okay? We will educate him. His mother was a Bavarian princess. She was tough as nails. And she kept telling me, says, you're too soft, you're too dumb. Listen to what I'm telling you. And by the way, she was a smart person. You get it? I want to tell you something. Franz Joseph was 18 years old. He had a father. The father was a loser. To the mother, said like this, he shouldn't be the next emperor. My husband's a dummy. My son should be the next emperor. I'm just saying, that's who she was, and Schwarzenberg was a smart guy, but it never works out. It's this, they make many movies over this. It didn't turn out that way. Schwarzenberg died very quickly in 1852, 4 years later. He didn't have time to do much. And Sophie, the mother, was famously displaced by Sissy. How many movies are there about Elizabeth, the Habsburg princess? He married the Bavarian princess. The mother says, a famous story, the mother says, you should marry the older sister. She's like me. And we all know, when it comes to marriage, you have to pick somebody as a good partner. Okay? It's not just looks. It's a good partner. Okay? And for emperor, empress, you need a good partner. and the older girl is the one married, but he met both sisters. He fell for the younger one, who was 16, and they got married. And she was, let's put it this way, she was very flighty and this and that and the other. But she was the most famous, most beautiful princess in Europe, and that's what he wanted. So that kicked out the mother and led him down the path of bad judgment. Like I say, there are movies about this. So the mediocre Franz Joseph ran the affairs by himself with mediocre results. For our purposes, because I'm not giving a whole history of the Austrian Empire today, just a little bit. For our purposes, suffice it to say that he got involved in a dumb war in a very dumb way and was badly defeated. That's this next thing over here. This is the Battle of Solferino. He allowed himself, like I say, without getting into too many details, although it's a very interesting story, he allowed himself to get involved in a war against the French and their Italian allies. He had a big battle, and he was beaten over there. This is a famous, they haven't translated into English yet. They've just made it into a mini-series a couple years ago, Radetzky March, by Joseph Rolfe. Joseph Rolfe is the most famous Jewish guy, novelist and journalist of the Austrian Empire, right? He lived in the 20th century. And, his stuff is so famous, very, very famous. And it's most, so there's Franz Joseph, like a dummy, looking out in the front lines. You know, in other words, that's a stupid place to be, okay? And this guy in the novel, what they show you, he saved his life, as you see over here, right? By pushing him aside, and he took the bullet instead, and then the story continues. So the point is that, you see, that wasn't good judgment, get it? If you're to command the army, you don't go in the front line, right? Now, anyway, as a result, it became clear after this defeat that Franz Joseph would have to start making liberal concessions to pacify German liberal opinion in Vienna, or else the state would go broke. Because the big bankers who had the money and the Austrian economy was always in dread. It's almost as bad as our economy today. What I mean by that is the national debt, right? I mean, raise your hand if you think we can pay the national debt, okay? So the big bankers said like this: as long as you run this autocratic system, which is obviously not working, we don't want to lend you the money. And so he had no choice but to do the right thing. And the right thing was to become more liberal, okay? And so there started a decade from 1859 to 1869 in which slowly, reluctantly, but he did do it, the emperor turned the empire into a much more democratic country with full civil rights for all the citizens. And this is where the Jews benefited. Get it? No, it's not because of the Jews, but once all this stuff happened, and he just had to open the whole business up, and he kept his bargain. Notice he said, I'm doing it, and he did it. So the Germans benefited, the Hungarians benefited, the Jews benefited, even the Hasidim, because once you say there's a full equality under the law, and everybody's got civil rights, and this, and that, the other, it applies to everybody. And from then on, for Jews, Austria-Hungary was an extremely liberal country for Jews. Much better off than many other countries, although there was a lot of anti-Semitism in there, as we shall see. But not from the legal perspective. Now, this took place in stages, and it didn't happen overnight, and there were all kinds of special and weird regional arrangements because they had so many different races and nationalities in the empire. There was, although the emperor hated to do it, the special status of Hungary, which favored the Magyars over the Croats, the Slovaks, and the Romanians. I know it doesn't mean much to you, but it's called Austria-Hungary. See how big Hungary is a piece of it? What happened was in 1867, after another losing war, he said to the Hungarians, he said, listen, let's make peace. They liked his wife. And he said like this, listen, I'll give you 100% independence within the empire. So in other words, other than foreign policy, the same currency and, military, you run your own darn country. So much so that they say, we're not part of the Austrian Empire, we're just associated with it. That's what they call Austria-Hungary. Right? He didn't want that, but he did it. And it kind of worked out. It was a screwball system. Every 10 years they had to renegotiate the contract. But this is what happened. So, mind you, this is all white. You don't see in there all the different shades of different minorities that the Hungarians were able to dominate and screw over and try to force them to do Hungarian language and all this kind of stuff. That was the deal. So when it comes to Europe, civil rights doesn't necessarily mean what you think. Civil rights means I have my freedom, and part of my freedom is the freedom to punch you in the face. That's part of my freedom. That's how it worked out, okay? He felt it necessary to do that. In Bohemia, for example, in this part we have the Czechs and the Germans fighting each other all the time. So it was a constant battle forever between the Czechs and the Germans over this issue and that issue. And there the emperor said like this, I'll be like the referee. Get it? I'll be the referee. What about Galicia? That's what we're interested in. Everything I spoke about now is to bring you to Galicia, which is here, okay? This chunk. So here they developed a kind of a perfect storm, sort of. You see, Franz Joseph, the emperor, had been reluctant to grant so much autonomy to the Hungarians, to the Magyars. He was reluctant to sell out the Croats and the Romanians and the others. He just felt the politics kind of impelled him to do that. He didn't want to do that again. I don't want to have another part of the empire which is totally federal. Now, historians will forever debate whether this is a good move or not. That's beyond our discussion tonight. He wanted the rest of the Austrian Empire to be under Austria. On the other hand, he realized if he prevented the Poles from exercising similar autonomy in Galicia, it would create an open wound and a constant problem, and he already had enough of those. So he wanted to pacify the Poles by giving them what they asked for, in return for which they will stay within the empire and be loyal to him. And so he cut a deal with them, whereby they got de facto what the Hungarians, what the Magyars received, but not in name. Galicia would be part of Austria, it wouldn't be a third country. No, they're not going to call it Austria-Hungary Galicia, just going to call it Austria-Hungary. But on the other hand, the Poles got their own parliament in Lemberg, and as long as they remained loyal to the emperor and didn't engage in political hanky-panky, they could pretty much govern themselves and screw over the Ukrainians and everywhere else they wanted to their heart's content, unless he refereed, okay? This is what they call being liberal in Eastern Europe. Now, for the Poles, this was a good deal, and they kept their bargain for the next 50 years, 1868 to 1918. And they had very good reason to. The late 19th century, which is what we're talking about now, there was no way an independent Poland was going to rise. The Russians aren't going to do it. The Prussians aren't going to do it. So this is basically the best possible deal, okay? Even if Austria agreed, Russia and Prussia would crush any attempt, as I showed you before. Austria had a peace, but Prussia had a peace and Russia had a giant peace. And they're the ones who are going to determine whether or not Poland will ever be restored, and it won't be. Knowing this fact, if you're an intelligent Polish leader, in Galicia, you say like this, autonomy and freedom in Galicia is the best possible in my lifetime. So let's take it. Okay, we are more fortunate than other Polish anywhere else, which was true. Okay, plus, and by the way, the Russians and the Prussians had an active campaign to keep the Poles down, to destroy their language and culture. I mean, it was like Putin and the Ukrainians. If Putin wins, or the areas that he's taken over, he has tried very hard to immediately Russify and change the textbooks and win the language war and change the character. You see, they're all white. So to a Russian bureaucrat, it's not like they're white and black and yellow, so then you can't change them. They're all white. So I can make them like me. They're different, they talk a different language. I can make them teach my language, or their children anyway. And they'll be all part of me. That's how these guys think over there in that part of the world, you see? So, and they were Catholic, the Russians were not Catholic, and the Poles are Catholic. Now, on the other hand, Austria is Catholic. And by the mid-19th century, Austria had given up any hopes of Germanizing everybody. We're not back, like in my first lecture, try to make everybody German. I mean, they just gave that up. You see, that's not going anywhere. Franz Joseph would be happy if all the various nationalities in his empire were simply loyal to him and just live a life. Stop trying to shoot your neighbor, just make a living, like that. And indeed, one of the reasons for being loyal was precisely the benign nature of Franz Joseph's rule. Benign in the sense of protecting the group rights of everyone in the monarchy, especially religious rights, unless you were one of those groups that politics allowed the other group to beat you up. The projected image of Austria, which was carefully cultivated by the Kaiser, changed from despotism to enlightened protection. For the Poles, this means they could be as Polish as they want as long as they didn't try to break away from the empire. As you can see from the map, even had they wished to break away, where could they go? And in addition, they had it better than the other Poles, as I told you over and over again. I mean, Bismarck, let's go to the next one, in Germany hated the Poles. So the government really persecuted them. Truth to tell, had the others agreed to restore Poland, Franz Joseph would not really have objected, because geographically, it'd be good for for Austria to have a buffer state in between them and the Russians. This is what I mean when I say there was a perfect storm. So all this that I've told you until now is what they call the background, the context, is this in Laban for the Jews who are living in the second half of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s in Galicia. All right? Now, so Franz Joseph and the Poles cut a deal, and from 1868 to the end of the First World War, which is 50 years, Galicia was pretty much a self-governing region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which gave no trouble to Franz Joseph, gave no trouble to the central government in Vienna. Actually, they were quite the opposite. They were very loyal to him. Why am I going through all this? How does it affect the Jews? It affected them big time. What it meant was that for almost a century, from 1772 to 1868, the Jews never had to take the Poles into account because the Austrians were ruling like that, and the only ones you had to kiss up to were the Austrians. Okay, from 1772, when they came in, till almost 100 years later, 1868, 96 years, if you're Jewish, who's the guy in charge? Who do you get a break from? Who makes the rules? Not the Poles. The Austrian governor, the bureaucrats, those are the guys who have it. So I want to kiss them. I'm going to learn German. I want to be very patriotic to the Kaiser and all this kind of stuff. The Poles, heck with them, you know? They don't count. But starting in 1868, the Jews suddenly do have to take the Poles into account because the Poles now are in charge, and they intended to rule the province like Jack Pollock. As we shall see, the Poles controlled the local state government, although the federal government in Vienna, which in the 1860s and 70s was controlled by the liberals, had the ultimate power. So it's pretty much like in America in that regard, in which the state of Maryland can pass laws, the federal government can override those things, okay? It was a complicated situation, and on top of the whole pile, sat the Emperor Franz Joseph. The difference between the Poles being in charge and the Austrians being in charge was significant, because the Austrians had ruled like superior colonists. All the different groups in Galicia are junk, but, to them. But the Poles was a different story. Now they're in charge. This is our country, and we're the master race. We were the nobles and the rulers here before. For the last 700 years, okay? In America, you say Polak. Over there, they had a great culture and empire. They were the ruling class for many centuries. Poland has a very impressive culture. The university in Krakow came before the universities in Germany. You understand? They had their own Renaissance and all the rest of it. And so now that they're in charge, they're going to implement let's put it this way. If I'm a Polish person, Polish patriot, how can you compare the Ruthenians, the other? They ain't got no culture. See, we are the main ones. No question about it. So they regarded themselves the master race. This was their country. And the Polish groups who gained political power included different types than the Polish Szlachta of the Rzeczpospolita. There were new groups among the Polish that rose to power, and it was bad for the Jews, okay? Because the new narrative that emerges from the new groups goes like this. Poland made a big mistake letting all those Jews in. The nobles just did it because they were interested in their own personal, pocketbook. You see? All they cared about was their own pocket. They didn't care about the fact that the country's filling up with all these Jewish types who are not Polish, and they're out of control, and they now buy everything, and they own everything, and all, So this was a big mistake. Really, 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 it would be the right thing to kick them all out. Now, they couldn't do that in the 19th century under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because Franz Joseph, everybody has civil rights. But this is the narrative that the Poles do. Now, there are some Polish nobles of the old variety who said, the Jews can be here as long as they mind their manners and things like that. And we are in the beginning of modern Polish politics, which when Poland will become an independent state after 1918, will exhibit an extreme anti-Semitism. This is just the way it goes. That's the 1920s and 30s, but the origins are now. The question was, what do you do with these doggone Jews now that they're here? And they're multiplying like crazy. So were the Poles. So the Jews had a baby boom. I'll say it again, what I've said many times, people don't know. It's very interesting that in the period I'm talking about, between 1830 and let's say 1930, the Jewish population in the world quintupled. It went from 3 million to 15 million. 3 million and something to 15 million something. That's crazy numbers. And where was this baby boom happening? Not in St. Louis, not in Saskatchewan, not in London, in Eastern Europe, in Galicia and Poland and those places. You understand? This is where the baby boom was happening. So if you're Polish, you say, what the heck is this, you know? Pretty soon, they're going to outnumber us. Even though that wasn't the case, you know, I always remember a story. I was a little kid, and they had Walter Cronkite, and at that time, this was 50, 60 years ago, and they had a thing like this, anti-Semitism in America. And Walter Cronkite talking to a lady in Louisville, Kentucky, and she said like this, how many Jews are there in America? 50 million. Wait a second, he said, well, listen, what would you say if I told you it's actually not 50 million, it's 5 million. 5 million, they must all live in Louisville. You understand? The point, this is a matter of perspective. You get it? So that's how the Poles thought. Now, for the Polish leaders in the next half century, there were two aspects of what we call the Jewish problem. See, now we're a problem. Now that they got the civil rights, what I'm trying to tell you is Europe does not have the Western narrative. The Western narrative is supposed to be as more things get liberal and more rights, things get better for more people. In Europe, when things get liberal, a group gets power and then sticks it to the other group, and therefore things get worse. It's weird, but that's how it goes. I'm talking about Middle and Eastern Europe. So now the Poles got civil rights. Now the Jews are regarded as a problem, and everybody talked about the Jewish question in capital letters or the Jewish problem in capital letters. Okay? Now first, will the Jews, here's the nature of the problem. Will the Jews in Eastern Galicia side with the Ruthenians, with the Ukrainians? This would exacerbate that problem, because after all, roughly speaking, this is the whole Galicia put together, 45, 45, 10, so they're the swing vote. But if you go to Eastern Galicia, so it's more like 65-27. You see, there's a massive 2/3 of the population is not Polish. Get it? I said it wrong. It was 17%. 65 and 17%, and the Jews are the rest. So think about that. Now, for the Poles, they say, oh my God, if the Jews, gang up with the Ruthenians, they'll vote us out of office and things like that. Second of all, the Poles asked the question, are the Jews assimilable? Can they be Polonized? I mean, look at these Hasidim. They're like irredeemable. Can we do anything with them or not? And third, do we want them to Polonize? Because then they're going to be in our movie theaters, they're going to be in our schools, they're going to be all over the place, in restaurants. And this placed the Jews of Galicia in a delicate spot. What do they do in those 50 years that I'm talking about now? Now, broadly speaking, by the mid and late 19th century, the Jews were divided into the frum and the not frum, as we saw yesterday. The non-frum, by definition, wanted a Western education and lifestyle. They wanted a European culture. Which European culture do you want? German? Polish. Used to be you wanted German because the Austrians in charge, that's the ones you want to kiss up to. After 1868, people started to say, wait a minute, if I'm going to get a secular education, I better learn Polish because that's the group. That's the one I got to blend into. Those are the guys I got to do business with. That's the culture I want to be part of if I'm the type that wants to assimilate. Now, if you're Hasidic, you don't, but I'm talking about if you do. And so there are a lot of people that caught the wrong thing, like middle-aged and older guys. They say, we spend all our life acquiring German culture, and that makes us one of the outs with the Poles, you see? So it was very complicated. That's why I keep saying that. Until the 1860s, when the Austrians ruled, it seemed to the non-frum, except perhaps in Krakow. Krakow was always a very intensely Polish place, but everywhere else, that the culture was similar to was the German culture, especially with the rise of the German liberals, who were the ones who emancipated the Jews. As I said before, what was it that finally led Franz Joseph and even Bismarck to grant the Jews civil rights, even though they may have done it holding their nose? There was the rise of the liberal parties within Germany and Austria. Now, it's 19th century liberal. It's not liberal like today, okay? It's 19th century liberal. And that means it's like Trump, in other words, strong capitalist. But precisely your capitalism militates against enshrining in law discrimination is based on religious belief. Based on the simple idea like this, it doesn't make sense economically just because this one's Jewish or that one's black or this one's this or that one's that to send it because this might be a better contribution to the economy. To use simple language, to use the simplest of language, if I got a company and let's say, for example, insurance, I'm trying to make money. Let's say there's this black guy that he's a very good insurance salesman. What am I going to say is, I'm George Wallace. I don't hire no black people at all. Okay, you dummy. He'll go and work for your competition. They'll make the money, you'll go under. So it's got nothing to do with political correctness, with a sense of actual respect for people regardless of their racial backgrounds. It's got nothing to do with that. It's got to do with that's 19th century liberal, you see? So they just felt it's wrong to discriminate on the basis of religious beliefs, even though they themselves are not crazy about the Jews. But on the other hand, if I'm Jewish, that's the group I want to, be like, because they're the ones who did me the favor of emancipating me. But after 1868, as I just told you, the Austrians were basically gone, and it was the Polish culture that had to be adopted. But there was no liberal Polish culture. There was no liberal Polish culture. By the time you get to the last part of the 19th century, Polish culture has gone the route of Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson. That's what it is. It's more like an Oberstein type thing, They were hard right. That's what it was. And even more so because they were distinctly anti-Semitic. Now, the Poles resented the Jewish liberalism. Okay? Now, if you're a Jew who wants to assimilate, you're confused and conflicted. I'm trying to be modern and all this. I thought I'm supposed to go liberal. What am I supposed to go now? Polish right wing? That doesn't quite work. I'm Jewish. I'm not Catholic. I can't pick up all that racist stuff. The non-Frum in Galicia divided into two groups, therefore. A, the total assimilationists, the Misbolim. There were people who said, like, I'm not converting, but besides that, I'm just totally shedding my Jewish identity. And I am identifying, as I said before, with all the Polish right-wing business. I just am. And their culture is my culture, and their stuff is my stuff, and their language is my language, like a reverse Ruth, you get it? Now, they did, as I said before, they left the Jewish world and lived on their own. They seriously Polonized. That's one group. There was another large group of Jews who were not from. They were modern Jews. They wanted a strong Jewish identity. Because if you're a Galician Jew, you come from strong Jewish roots. And you don't simply want to turn your back and say it's all junk. See, the other guys did. But this is the group who said, I guess I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, this and the other. But I'm proud to be Jewish. Okay? They didn't want a from Jewish identity. In Germany, they would have become active Reform and conservative Jews. Okay? In Galicia, they had to work out their own derech as proud Jews, even though they're post-religious. These Jews formed a whole organization called Shomer Yisrael, right after the emancipation. Shomer Yisrael. Shomer Yisrael is the non-Frum group, right? They wanted to assert a strong Jewish pride identity. They wanted to sponsor various modern chinuch and other cultural events and projects. In other words, they wanted, like we would say in America, the Federation, the Associated, that sort of thing. Indeed, the Shomer Yisrael did try to influence and even control the various official communities, the kehillas, because there were legal official communities, in such matters as schooling, the election of modern rabbis of one sort or another. They even advocated establishing a Jewish theological seminary in Lemberg or Krakow, and they published a newspaper with a very strong anti-Frum stance, very similar to what evolved, it's not exactly, but it's similar to what evolved in America, let's say, 100 years ago. Now this is in the process of dying out, but, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, it was thriving. All this, of course, was raising a red flag at the Frum Jews for whom the Shomer Yisrael had contempt. In general, the Shomer Yisrael was politically liberal, and they said they wanted Germanization, because at that time, when they started, German was identical with liberal in Austria. And it was the Austrian German liberals who had passed the emancipatory federal laws. It was the Austrian Germans who had pressured the Poles to give the Jews the rights at the state level. You see, when he gave them their state autonomy, like I said, Jack Pollock, Franz Joseph is like this, but you got to get right into state laws that the Jews have equal rights. Poles didn't want to do it. They did not want to do it. And it was a whole tug back and forth. And Franz Joseph is like, then the deal's off. Well, if you put it like that, okay, hold my nose, right in there, the Jews too have equal rights. They didn't want to. So, therefore, if I'm in the Shomer Yisrael, let's say I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm a successful business person, I got my Jewish pride, right? I mean, I'm a modern person, I like to go to the movies and all the rest of it. I got my Jewish pride. Heck with these Poles. They, why should I be interested in them? They tried to crush me. If they had their way, if the emperor dropped dead tomorrow, they'd yank all the rights away from us. That way of thinking, you see? Now, in general, as I said before, so it was understandable that these Shomer Yisrael types, the Austrian German liberals, are the ones to be supported, which turned out to be a can of worms. Here we go. As I said, in 1868, it started a new world for the Jews. First of all, they got full equality and civil rights for the first time in history. So you have Jews living in Poland, where the Jews had lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, never had equal rights under the law. Get it? Instead, they had that screwball system that we spoke about many times, where they made themselves of service to the nobles and blah, blah, blah. They worked out their own way, but it was never that you're a citizen with actual rights. And now, the biggest chassid can vote. And, he's a full citizen, you see? So it was weird. This was new to them. They're now players, they can vote for the first time in history. Well, this was a plus and a minus in the poison politics of Galicia, because now is going to be a race in the next election between two candidates. One is a Ukrainian candidate, one is a Polish candidate. Okay, Jew, which one are you voting for? Whoever you vote for, you made enemies of the other group. You get it? It's almost to a certain degree like it was better when we didn't vote. You see what I'm saying? Israel had this problem when they became a member of the UN in 1949. Then all of a sudden they had to decide, they voting for America or for Russia? And every time they voted for, like Truman, Stalin got angry, you see? So in a certain way, it would have been safer for them not to be in the UN. They had reasons for being in the UN. I'm just saying, elections are tricky, and in Austria and in Galicia, they didn't have the secret ballot. That's a later invention called the Australian ballot, where you put, nobody knows. In European elections, for a long, long time, you go in, everybody gets to see who you're voting for. I'm going to make a million enemies, whatever happens. It's not so simple. So, in the first federal elections to the Reichsrat, that was the federal parliament, in 1873, the Shomer Yisrael, who are basically, I would say, Oberstein liberals, publicly supported the German liberal candidates over the Polish candidates. You hear what I said? They supported the German liberal candidates over the Polish ones. Indeed, they cut a deal with the Ruthenians to jointly oppose the Polish candidates. So in other words, they ran Polish candidates and supported Ukrainian ones across Galicia, including districts where the Jews were in the majority, because there were towns, as we were talking about before, where Jews were the majority and sometimes the totality of the population. There's little places. So the Jewish vote matters. Now, it's so funny, because this is 1860, 1870, nothing like this was even thinkable in Tsarist Russia. Nobody votes. You see? And here, there's elections, and even the Hasidim are voting. You see? So it couldn't happen anywhere else, by the way, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, simply because everywhere else in the Austrian Empire, Jews are a small minority. It don't matter who they vote for. There are 40, 50,000 Jews in the whole Bohemia. You understand? Doesn't matter who you're voting for. In Hungary, there was no particular district where the Jews were an overwhelming majority. But in Galicia, like I said before, you had there were many towns in which the Jews were like 95% of the population. Villages, towns, things like that. And so the Jewish vote is the vote, you see? And even if they were half of that, even if the Jews were 50% or 40% of the population, that's a giant piece of the vote, you see? So, by the way, it didn't happen anywhere else until the USA in the 20th century. In America today, you got your Jewish vote, whether you like it or not, because you got these Hasidic groups in New York State and whatever. And why did Hillary Clinton go and visit, Kiryas Yoel before the election of 2000? Remember that? When she ran for the Senate. She ain't in love with the Hasidim. And by the way, after her visit, 2 weeks later, I remember Bill Clinton pardoned like 3 Hasidic guys that were in jail or something like that. And so anyway, the Poles certainly got angry, more than that enough. But so did the Frum. Because I'll tell you again, who told you they should be so liberal to get the rest of us Jews in trouble? Who appointed you the leader of everybody else to be spokesman for us? They grew scared that Shomer Yisrael would become politically dominant, and they would enact their whole program. They would start a conservative movement, a Jewish theological seminary, a whole different set of modern Jewish schools, and the whole business. This threat in their own front yard energized the Belzer Rebbe at the time. This was the middle Rebbe of the Belz, okay? Now, they were pretty much the biggest, or second biggest, probably the biggest Hasidic group in Eastern Galicia. I'm talking about thousands of Jews. And he realized, if it's a new electoral system, I control a lot of votes. Not control a lot of votes. Because if Simon says, if I say to do it, they'll do it. And so he said like this, we have to act against these liberal Jews who are going to take the rest of us down. That's how he saw it. Okay? This typified Hasidic politics. They're always very politically quiescent, unless it's in your own front yard. It's like these are local politics, you see? Now, the Rebbe, pulling strings from behind the scenes, organizes in the 1870s and establishes a mirror organization to the Shomer Yisrael. You have a liberal Jewish organization with branches all over Galicia. I'm going to establish an ultra-Orthodox organization with branches all over Galicia. Okay? And he called it the Machzikei Das, the defenders of religion. What I'm saying is that the Machzikei Das would field from candidates for parliament. I want religious guys running for parliament. I want these other liberal Jews, because they don't represent us. They're actually, we consider them a danger. He established the first Haredi newspaper called the Kol Machzikei Das. These are firsts, which you and I know, looking back after 100 and some years, were, what's the right word? Harbingers, you understand? This is more that's coming down the road. This is the beginning of the politicization, you might say, of the Haredi. Okay? I'm talking about something happened 40 years before the Aguda started. This is the beginnings of the Aguda type thing. Now, the whole enterprise, like I said, 35 years they were there. By this time, it was clear that there are going to be a couple of Jewish electoral districts. As I said before, there were whole districts when the Jews were the overwhelming majority of the voters. If only all Jews would unite to elect agreed-upon candidates for the Imperial Parliament in Vienna, then they could have rocked. You understand? Because there were many districts in Galicia in which the Jewish vote would have crunched it. So if the Jews would have been able to bury the hatchet, which they weren't, among each other, and say, listen, we don't agree on Shabbos, and we don't agree on religion, but we should at least agree, I'm going to make this up. We should at least agree that we want a representative in Parliament who will fight anti-Semitism. I think we should be able to agree on that. If we could just agree on that, and we combine the Hasidic vote on the one hand, and the non-from vote on the other hand, and all this kind of stuff, then we're able to put a whole bunch of guys in office who will defend our interests. But they couldn't do that, could they? Any more than they can do it today. The modern Jewish community, ever since the revolution, is a broken wheel. They don't communicate with each other. They're all against each other. They see each other as enemies. It's how it goes. And so they couldn't unite. Ideology and religion had torn them apart, which, of course, allowed the Poles to play one off against the other. Why not? Okay? Why not? And so the bottom line is, if they wanted to win the elections, the Machzikei Das, the ultra-Orthodox, would have to get out their voters, not just Jewish voters. They have to get every Hasidic type guy, every stark Misnagid guy out there to vote for the candidate. But the question is, who do you get to run for office? You can't get some Hasidic schlepper. You get it? The idea of getting some loser to be your member of parliament, that had to wait till the state of Israel. In those days, you needed somebody that was impressive. You understand? Somebody impressive. Where are you going to find in Galicia where, none of the big Rabbanim could speak German, they all speak Yiddish. And the Galiciano Yiddish, which is ridiculous in Vienna, and they didn't, know how to use a knife and a fork. And all this, I'm telling you, you don't realize how primitive this was by Western standards. There's a book, came out a year ago, Marienbad. It's very good, by this family that used to run. Marienbad is one of the spas in Bohemia. It's actually in Sudetenland. And, that was posh. That was, Carlsbad, Marienbad. Even today, if you go, in my tour, I didn't go there because we had too much to do, But if you want to spiffy and had some Iranian tour guide say, I'll take you to Marienbad, you can go and hang around the spa and so forth. But in the 1800s, this was the rich and the famous and the Rebbes. Understand? And they always go out there, and because in the 19th century, it was a very strong belief, if you take the cure, you drink the right mineral water, it'll cure everything. I'm not a doctor, so I don't know, but that's what they all believe. And this guy had his family had a kosher, strictly kosher hotel restaurant for decades in Marienbad. Therefore, he saw all the biggies. And the guy was very frum, the owner, a yeke, And he said he had the bells of Rebbe there. Ooh. And he was always eating like this. And he thought he must think that I didn't toivel the silverware. So, which of course he did, but he said, just to make sure, So he went and retitled everything. They're still using this. He went to the Belz Rebbe and said like this, I want you to know, I titled everything yesterday, every last fork. And the Belz Rebbe said, see these hands? I titled them this morning. It's a different way of thinking. So you can't send a guy like this to be a member of parliament. So what are you going to do? Okay? Can't be a schlepper. So the Belz Rebbe said, I guess, let's get the Krakow Rav. Krakow was the son of Chassam Sofer. Highly sophisticated. A great Talmud Chacham, of course. President Shimon Sofer. Grew up in what I would say a royal family. Okay? What do I mean by a royal family? Go to the next one. Try to match that yichus. Father was a Chassam Sofer, grandfather was Rabbi Kiva Eger. What I mean by that is great refinement. It's not only they were great scholars, they brought up in the Jewish version of aristocratic. You understand? Very fine. And therefore, he speaks a good German. He had the, I don't think he went to college or anything like that, chas v'shalom, but he had the equivalent of education. He read the newspaper. Yeah. Within the framework we're talking about, he was a sophisticated person. And he was, okay? He would be somebody who could represent the Jewish people, the Frum people, in the Imperial Parliament in Vienna with dignity and so on, make the case for us, okay? As I said before, by the standards of Galicia, he had a high level of secular education, right? And he had an aristocratic bearing, as you might know. And as the rabbi of Jewish Krakow, that's a city where half the place was Hasidic, half the place was anti-Frum. He had to walk a tightrope, now had to handle the authorities. So he was what we would call a sophisticated individual. So they run him as a candidate for parliament, and he won. They're shocked. The liberals were, the Jewish liberals were like shocked, right? I mean, actually, all throughout Europe, all the Reformed Jews, everything went crazy. If you read the headlines, the sky is falling, right? Now, to tell you the truth, he was elected to parliament, he was very successful, but he always voted like the Poles. He sat down with the Polish group, and not with the German liberals. He went with the Tafa, let's go to the next one. Franz Joseph, at one point, after 20 years of liberal rule, he switched to Count Tafa, who was his best friend, personal friend, and who organized, Count Tafa was a famous Austrian statesman, and he organized the conservatives and some of the liberals together in what's called the Iron Ring. And he basically was trying to get everybody on board. Now, I'm going to tell you something. The Jews, he basically said to the Jewish electorate and representatives, join my group, I'll give you what you want, I'll fund the seminaries and things like that, just like I do for the Catholics. The Jewish liberals, who are trying to be more liberal than the Austrian liberals, says, it's a tough Germanish. We wouldn't deal with somebody like that. You understand? It's like somebody's like this. I don't care what Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem. If he did, it's bad. You see, that's how the mentality was. And so the result was that, because, really, let's go to the next one, right? They consider, he was the big Orthodox rabbi in Vienna, the Schiffschul, Spitzer, son-in-law of Chassam Sofer, Spitzer. The Frum Shul in Vienna was in the Schiffgasse, on Ship Street. They called it the Schiffschul. I mean, it was a big fancy shul. And he said like this, Tafa is the best friend of the Jews, but the Jews are always spitting on him. You understand? And so it's very interesting, and it's very similar to the Trump phenomenon. Anyway, Shimon Sofer, who was the parliamentary representative, he said like this. He's a Frum guy. He said like this. You got to be realistic. We live in Galicia. The Poles are the great majority. You got to get along with them. You understand? I'm not going to go and vote against something that they hate and this and that and the other. We Jews don't get anything out of it. We just make the liberals feel good. And every time we do something like that, a whole bunch of poor Jews who are employees of some Polish guy get fired. Or they kick guys off the land. Or they do bad things. We got to, if you're living in this country, you got to figure out a way to live with the people inside of you. And so the anti-Semitic newspaper interviewed him and said, oh, he's not such a bad guy, things like that. And basically, this was the general philosophy of the Hasidim in Galician politics and later in the Polish politics of the Republic of Poland, which is that they would say like this, I'm not going to take any principled stand in public against the government, against the Polish. If I have a personal Jewish thing I have to deal with, let's talk about it behind closed doors. You understand? That's what it was. Publicly, I'll back whatever you need to do. I may need an exception for the synagogue or to get somebody off of work for Shabbos or something. We'll talk about that behind the closed door. That was their way of doing politics. You see? As opposed to the Shomer Yisrael, it's like this. Stand for your principles. And if it's wrong, call it out. So you just had two different schools of how to be politically active. You get it? Two different schools. Now, I'm trying to think how to explain this. This was obviously a fundamental dispute between the religious and non-religious Jews as to what provoked anti-Semitism. To the non-frum Jews, they said, you know what provokes Polish anti-Semitism? The outlandish dress and deportment of the Hasidim. You guys are such a turnoff that's repulsive. To the religious Jews, they said, no, it's your pushiness and liberalism that ticks the Poles off. Now, who was right? Both were right. The Poles were anti-Semitic on both counts. Right? They couldn't stand the way the religious looked. They couldn't stand the Jewish liberals either. You see? So it's not a game you could win. From then on, the Jews from and not from were players in the Notorian Galician elections, which is really Jack Pollock times 10, because boy did it get dirty over there. The Poles cheated and gerrymandered all over the place, and so they were generally able to mess over the Ruthenians. The Jews, especially in the countryside, simply could not tick off the Poles for economic as well as physical security reasons. And so they usually voted Polish with the kind of backroom deals characteristic of New York City politics today. Drohobych, Sinyatin, all these little places nobody ever heard of. Here are the Jews, here's the Polish guys, they're all over the place. Down the street is the Galicia and the church, all the rest of it. If you're going to vote the wrong way, they're going to make a riot. And if you don't get it right, you'll at least get an economic boycott, or you get all this, I gotta do what I gotta do. I gotta do what I gotta do. So, you say it's not free democracy. Okay, so it's not. But that's how it works. Okay? On the other hand, the Jews too had pride, and the Polish anti-Semitism did tick them off, particularly the Shomer Yisrael types. They weren't the only ones that were ticked off. And so, very interesting, it did happen occasionally, but not often, that they would elect a Jewish Jew. Listen, especially Dr. Bloch, who was, Rakam Sakam. He was he was an Austrian Jew, he's a Galician, he got a Western education, he was in Vienna, a rabbi Bashul Bells, a PhD, and he was a fighter like David and Goliath against all the anti-Semites. He took him on, and he wasn't afraid to call a spade and call him out. He became the other Jews didn't like it. They say, you're too, pushy. I'm talking about against the anti-Semites. He became famous because there was a Professor Rowling, who was professor of Semitics at the Prague University. He wrote a whole book called Talmud Yudah, in which he said, really, the blood libel is true, and the Talmud says you can do this, and all this other junk about the Jews. And the other Jews said, I don't want to talk about it, don't give them too much publicity. Well, everybody read the book. This guy was the only guy who had the nerve. He said like this, why is everybody quiet around here? I'm suing you publicly. I call you a damn liar. That's what he said. I call you a damn liar, and I dare you, and everything. You can't even read a page in Hebrew. You see? And I dare you to sue me in court, and I'll wipe the floor with you. So when he used such provocative language, the guy had no choice. He was a professor. He had to sue him in court. You see? And the other Jews said, oh my God, what are you doing? All the rest of it. And even the Rabbanim said, what are you doing? And he gave an interview with the paper. He said like this, when it comes to court, I'm going to bust this guy so bad, I'll expose him for the total thing. Well, guess what? The day of the trial, the guy withdrew the suit. The morning of the thing. And then all the Jews said like this, I knew it all the time. We were on your side. He said, we were on your side all the time. And he went on like this. So he was elected as the member of parliament from Galicia, from the Jewish neighborhood, Jewish district. And he was there. He called it out. I mean, you really should read his speeches over there, because he didn't take nothing from nobody. They gave it to him right in the nose. And he was a very good polemicist. You understand? They say, the Jews are in charge of all the prostitution. Really? Let's take a look at the records over here. And by the way, I see 2 houses that are owned by you on the list of the police. And you're the head of the Catholic Party. You know what I'm saying? He called it out like it was. So eventually the Poles had too much of this, and they conspired with the other Jews to take him down in the elections. You see, it's politics is a dirty business. Okay? There was a guy, I will tell you something. there was another guy, Father Deckert, a big priest, and he published the whole thing that he's going to prove the blood libel is, and he took the guy to court. The guy took him up on it. He took him to court, and the guy went to jail for 10 years for defamation of character and for lying about the Jewish people. Went to jail for 10 years. Okay? People don't know about him. Now, I'll tell you right now. Let's go to the next one. Tafel liked him, and he said like this, you want to make a seminary or a Jewish school system or anything like that, I'll back it. The other Jews in the community said, you take it from him, it's like take it from Trump, we'll fire you. You see? So notice he couldn't even do anything for the Jewish people because the richy riches in the Vienna community were so committed to the other side of the political spectrum that they wouldn't do anything that would ultimately help. It's quite a story. There's a whole book by this, if you're interested, by Professor Wistrich. Robert Wistrich, who's a famous person, called The Jews in Vienna at the Time of Franz Joseph. It's a very well-known book. Bloch, who was a Jewish candidate, but from Galicia, he got along with the Poles. He said like this, I'm not voting for the Poles, I don't give a darn about the Poles. I don't give a darn about the Ruthenians. I'm Jewish, I'm voting for the Jews. I don't care about the Poles. And the Poles, the Ruthenians, like this. That makes sense. He said, the problem they don't like is when you take sides. You see? That makes sense. As a matter of fact, he was supported by the number one richest aristocrat, Count Potocki, Alfred Potocki, in Galicia. He bankrolled him. It's quite a story, you know? You could write a book about this. Now, the other type of Polish politicians, though, were also rising to the fore. And these Polish politicians by the 1880s and 90s are already repeating the slogan that we need. I know this is going to sound funny, or not funny. Their slogan was, we need a final solution to the Jewish question. The final solution is either convert or move to Palestine. And that's what they used to write these things in placards. You understand? So it's not Hitler, right? It's not Hitler, but it's, get out of here or convert. Now, these guys, as I said before, took Bloch down eventually. If they could, they would make pogroms and generally messed over the Jews in Galicia because they hated the Jews like fire. But the emperor wouldn't let them. Okay? And this is where the role of the emperor was so important in the 1870s down to the First World War, because Franz Joseph had as his slogan, justice is the foundation of the empire. Justitia regnorum, fundatio regnorum. Justice is the foundation of the empire. And I want to show you something. I found a Polish painting, okay, where the emperor is visiting Lemberg. And here are all the representatives of the different religious groups, and here's the Beis Yitzchak. Can you see the rabbi there? There he is. Yeah. Right? This is a Polish painter. That's a very famous rabbi, the Beis Yitzchak. He's in there. And Franz Joseph made a speech, and look what he said. I will tolerate no Jew baiting in the empire. Every anti-Semitic movement will be dipped in the bud. And why did he make that speech in the middle of Galicia? He knew what was happening. You understand? Now, I'm not saying they kept their word. There was so much anti-Semitism, it's hard to sit on it all. But at least the guy at the top is sending down a message, we're not standing for this. And at least until 1918, the anti-Semites did not have the legal power to do what they would like to do. Right? That's what they like to do. And that's why the Poles, when they heard this, let me put it this way. When he gave that speech, all the Poles like this, damn. What do you have to say that for? And as a result, as you see over here, Franz Joseph was incredibly popular. This is from the Radetzky March. This is when he, in his old age, visiting look at the people. It's a Czech series. You'll see many are Hasidic, in a village in Galicia, because he's on his way to inspect the garrison. These are Jewish women, these are Hasidic types, all the rest of it. You understand? And, right? And you see, and because they say like this, he's the guy standing between us and the Polacks. That's what it is. He's the one standing to us in Polish. And I'll show you something even better than that I found 2 days ago. There wasn't a Beis Yaakov movement at that time, but there were Jewish girls' schools. Here, let's go to the next one. That's the emperor in his old age. 1 second, I'll show you in a second. This is a Jewish school, there's the rabbi. See it? Yeah. So in other words, when we went to a community, you go to the Catholic place, you go to the Protestant place, and you go to the Jewish place. That's all. No discrimination or anything like this. And it's a famous story when we visited Jerusalem in 1869. It's a very well-known story that the synagogue couldn't be completed. They couldn't put the top on, and then this in Bechtel, and he said, I'll pay for it, and they put the top on. And the idea was like this. I support Catholic institutions in the Holy Land, and I support also Jewish institutions in the Holy Land. Now, this was very unusual, right? And as a result, the Jews really loved him. And that's why they called him the hero of Franz Joseph, Franz Joseph. And they had all these, this is the story about the shul in Jerusalem, and he was venerated because, as I said before, he stood between them and big trouble. You get it? It's as simple as that. It's not they loved the way he looked. He stood between them and the big trouble. And he was basically the only one, but he was the top guy. And it so happened that, let's put it this way, it's a shaky foundation. Will it survive him? But he went on and on. He went on to the age of 86. So basically, if you lived in Galicia at that time, like Rabbi Hertzberg and people like that, they loved the emperor because as long as he's alive, let's put it this way, when they made a bracha, keep living, it wasn't just an expression. No, because they knew if he dies, who knows what's happened after that? You see? Who knows what happens after that? Although, when it ended, trouble really came, as we shall see. But until 1914, for 50 years, that's a long time, from 1868, for 50 years, the Jews had it good. Against what the Poles wanted. In other words, they had it good in spite of what the Poles wanted to do to them. Now, the Poles also had it good. They ran the country. They ran Galicia. But to the degree that they wanted to stick it to the Jews, they weren't able to. With all of its problems in terms of internal Jewish life, as we shall see tomorrow, these were the golden years of Galician Jewry, thanks to the strong protection of the emperor, who became a Jewish folk hero. We will turn to that tomorrow, and with that I bid you good night. Go ahead.